The night was unnervingly calm, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside Officer Emily Roberts. She had patrolled the quiet streets of New Berlin countless times before, but tonight felt different. The cold March air had given way to an unexpected warmth. The streets were quieter than usual, and the faint hum of her patrol car was almost comforting in its monotony. As she passed the small strip mall, something caught her attention. A silver sedan, moving just slightly too slowly for the time of night, drew her gaze. It wasn't the speed or erratic driving that caused her to take a second glance. It was something far more unsettling. Through the rear passenger window, she saw a small arm hanging out. A toddler. Her stomach tightened, instinctively knowing something was wrong. As the car moved closer to the intersection, Emily's eyes tracked the scene, now focused solely on the figure of the child. She could see it clearly, a little hand flailing in the wind, the head of the child occasionally bobbing into view. The tiny figure was unrestrained, dangling precariously outside the window, exposed to the dangers of the night. Emily's hand hovered over the radio, and she called it in. "Dispatch, I have a possible child endangerment situation here at the strip mall parking lot. Silver Nissan, child unrestrained in the backseat. License plate is..." Her voice trailed off as the car weaved slightly within its lane, a subtle sign that something wasn't quite right. When the vehicle approached a red light at Coffee Road and sailed right through it, narrowly missing an oncoming SUV, the decision was made. The situation had escalated. This wasn't just a minor traffic violation. This was something far more dangerous. She flicked on her siren, lights flashing in the darkness, and pulled the car over into a nearby parking lot. As she approached the driver's side, she couldn't help but notice the disarray of the car's interior. The smell of fast food, wrappers, and discarded bottles of liquor filled the air. The sight made her gut clench. This wasn't just a case of reckless driving. There was something much deeper at play here. Inside the car, a young man, his shirtless torso barely covered by a jacket, fumbled with his wallet. He was visibly agitated, his movements jerky and unfocused. "License and registration, please," Emily said, her tone calm yet firm. Her eyes darted to the back seat where the young woman, blonde and disheveled, was struggling to control the squirming child in her lap. The boy's face was flushed with distress, his cries cutting through the air. He was too young for this, too small to be in a situation like this. Emily's mind raced. There was something about this that felt off in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "Is this your child?" she asked the woman, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the situation. The woman, who would later be identified as Sarah Thompson, looked up, her gaze fogged with alcohol. "Yeah. What's the problem?" She slurred, her words sluggish and heavy. Emily's heart sank as she looked closer at the baby. There was something about his eyes that seemed lost. Not the kind of lost you'd expect from a child in an unfamiliar place, but something deeper. A sadness that didn't belong in such a young soul. The toddler's cries were growing more frantic, and it was clear the situation was far from normal. "Your child wasn't in a car seat," Emily said, trying to keep her voice even. She had seen dangerous situations before, but this felt different. "I observed him hanging out of the window, moving with the car. That's illegal. You need to have him properly secured." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, trying to avoid eye contact as she gripped the child tighter. Her words came out in fits and starts, a strange combination of denial and defensiveness. "He's fine. He's fine," Sarah muttered, as though trying to convince herself more than Emily. Emily could smell the alcohol now. It was thick in the air, and she could see the remnants of empty bottles strewn across the floorboards. Something inside her stirred. This wasn't just a case of child endangerment. This was a deeper issue. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID," Emily requested, her voice taking on an edge of authority. She wasn't about to let this go. As Sarah rummaged through her cluttered purse, Emily's instincts were on high alert. She kept a sharp eye on the child, who was still crying. his tiny face distorted with fear. In that moment, Emily realized that this wasn't a simple mistake. It was the result of something far more troubling. The boy's distress wasn't just a result of being in an unfamiliar car. It was the kind of fear a child develops when they're accustomed to violence, when they've learned to expect pain from the one person who should be protecting them above all else. The sound of footsteps behind her signaled Officer Malone's arrival, his presence a quiet reassurance. But even with the backup, Emily felt an uneasy tension hanging in the air. As she continued to address Sarah, explaining the importance of child safety, it became evident that Sarah was growing more agitated. Her words grew sharper, her movements more erratic. She was barely holding it together. Then, in an instant, Sarah's face hardened, and before either officer could react, she struck the child. A slap, sharp and unforgiving, echoed in the night. The baby's cry was immediate, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a cry of frustration or fear. It was the cry of a child who had been betrayed, a cry of abandonment from the one person who should have protected him. The sound reverberated in Emily's chest, leaving her breathless for a moment. "Are you kidding me?" Officer Malone exploded, stepping forward in disbelief. Emily's heart pounded, but her training kicked in. She moved quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for her radio. The situation had escalated beyond a simple traffic stop. The child was in immediate danger, and there was no time to waste. Emily's mind raced. This was no longer about a broken law or a mistake on the road. This was about saving a life. With her voice steady but firm, she ordered Sarah to step out of the vehicle. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle now," Emily commanded. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of authority. When Sarah didn't immediately comply, Emily's tone hardened. "That's not a request." As the seconds ticked by, Emily could feel the weight of the moment settle over her. She had been in many tense situations before, but this felt different. It was a turning point. One moment, one wrong decision, could make all the difference in the world. And in that moment, as she reached into the car to take the child into her arms, she knew that she was stepping into a much bigger story, one that would unravel a long, painful history of neglect, addiction, and generational trauma. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet streets of New Berlin, casting long, jagged shadows on the pavement. Officer Emily Roberts kept a steady hand on her radio, her focus never wavering from the scene before her. Sarah Thompson sat in the driver's seat, her hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, but her eyes were unfocused, her mind miles away from the present moment. The child, a small boy, was still crying in the back seat, his cries now almost frantic, as though he sensed the growing tension. Emily could feel it too, the weight of the situation pressing down on her, tightening around her chest. She glanced at Officer Malone, who stood a few paces behind, scanning the surrounding area. They both knew that this wasn't just another traffic stop. Something about this felt wrong from the moment they had approached the vehicle. The signs were there: unrestrained child, erratic behavior, the telltale signs of someone under the influence. But what stood out the most was the fear in the child's eyes. It wasn't the fear of a child in an unfamiliar place. It was the kind of fear that spoke of neglect, of mistreatment, of a life lived in constant turmoil. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. She had dealt with hostile situations before, but this felt different. It was as if the air itself was charged with something unspoken, something dark that hung heavy between the officers and Sarah. Sarah didn't move right away. Instead, she turned her head slightly, her bloodshot eyes meeting Emily's gaze with a mix of confusion and anger. "What? What for?" Her voice was slurred, and her words were barely coherent, as if she couldn't quite process the reality of what was happening. She reached out to hold the child tighter, clutching him to her chest protectively. But it was a false protection. There was nothing comforting in the way her hands trembled. The child, a small boy no older than 2 or 3, seemed oblivious to the conversation around him. His face was streaked with tears, and his little hands reached out, grasping at nothing. Emily felt her heart twist as she looked at him. It was a cry for help, silent, but clear. He was reaching out for something, someone, anyone. But it wasn't Sarah who he reached for. Emily could see that much. "Ma'am, please," Emily repeated, her voice steady. "You need to step out of the vehicle. You're under suspicion for driving under the influence, and I need to make sure the child is safe." It was clear Sarah wasn't listening. The grip on the child tightened, and her lips trembled as if she was struggling to hold back a breakdown. She finally spoke, her words barely above a whisper. "He's fine. He's just tired. He just needs to sleep," she muttered, as though trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Emily's heart sank at the words. She had heard them before, the excuses, the justifications from parents who were too far gone in their own troubles to realize what they were doing to their children. It was the same story over and over again. Children trapped in toxic cycles, clinging to whatever semblance of love they could get, even if it came in the form of an abusive hand or a negligent embrace. "Step out of the vehicle now." Emily's voice took on a harder edge. She couldn't let this moment pass without action. The child was in danger. The moment Sarah had hit him was enough to warrant immediate intervention, but the fact that she was refusing to cooperate made it all the more urgent. It took a moment, but Sarah finally unbuckled her seatbelt and, with a groan, stepped out of the car. Her movements were slow, unsteady, as if she were struggling to keep her balance. Emily noted the way Sarah swayed slightly, her hands trembling. She wasn't just intoxicated. She was consumed by something much deeper, the darkness that had led her here, to this place, at this moment. As Emily stepped forward, she could hear the child's cries grow louder, more desperate. She took a deep breath, then moved quickly to the back of the car, her hands gently reaching for the boy. She needed to get him out of that environment, away from the chaos that surrounded him. The moment their eyes met, something inside Emily broke. The child's tear-streaked face seemed to say everything. His world was broken, and he was waiting for someone to fix it. "Hey, little one," Emily whispered softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from the child's forehead. He recoiled slightly, instinctively pulling back from her. His body was tense, his little hands curling into fists. It took all of Emily's restraint not to pick him up immediately, to comfort him in the way he desperately needed. But she knew better than to rush. Every moment was critical, and she needed to be careful. With a final, gentle motion, Emily scooped the child into her arms, feeling the weight of his small body settle against her chest. He didn't stop crying, but the frantic edge to his sobs began to soften. It wasn't much, but it was something. Emily rocked him gently, murmuring soft reassurances in his ear, though she knew that the damage was far deeper than a few kind words could heal. Behind her, Sarah was still standing, her face flushed with frustration. "What are you doing?" "That's my kid," she yelled, her voice rising with panic. Emily glanced back, meeting her gaze for a brief moment. "I'm taking him to safety," Emily said calmly, her voice unwavering. She wasn't backing down, not this time. Not with this child in her arms, not with that look in his eyes. At that moment, something shifted. Sarah's anger began to fade, replaced by a flicker of something else. Fear, perhaps. It was as though she finally understood the gravity of the situation. The fear in Emily's voice, the urgency in her actions. It was clear now that her child was no longer safe in her care. And in that realization, Sarah's shoulders slumped, her head falling forward in defeat. "Please, don't take him," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I can't do this anymore." Her words trailed off, swallowed by the night. Emily's heart ached, but she knew this was the only way. There was no saving Sarah in this moment, not until she was ready to be saved herself. But the child, he needed to be free of this toxic cycle. He needed a chance. As Emily turned and started to walk towards the patrol car with the child in her arms, the sirens wailing softly in the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, complicated journey. A journey for the boy she held in her arms, but also for Sarah, who, in some twisted way, might still be waiting for someone to save her too. The steady hum of the patrol car's engine was a strangely comforting sound as Officer Emily Roberts drove toward the precinct. Ethan nestled quietly in her arms. The child had stopped crying, but he hadn't stopped clutching at her shirt, his tiny fingers curling into the fabric as though he feared she might slip away. Emily's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror as she adjusted the volume on the radio, her mind replaying the events that had just unfolded. The car ride was quiet, but the silence felt heavy. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, where everything was calm and still, but rather the kind of quiet that enveloped you when everything around you had just shifted. Emily's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She had been a cop long enough to know that these moments were rare, and that they were the ones that would stay with her long after the badge was put away for the night. Ethan had calmed down, his little head resting against her chest. He was exhausted, too young to fully understand the chaos that had erupted around him. But his body, rigid with the tension of an entire lifetime's worth of neglect, had relaxed against her, trusting her in a way that made Emily's heart ache. She glanced down at him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. The red mark on his cheek was still visible, a cruel reminder of the mother who had abandoned him in that moment of rage. She felt the anger building in her chest again, hot and sharp. She tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the task ahead. Sarah Thompson was now in custody, though Emily knew that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. The charges against her were serious, and the assault on Ethan was just the tip of the iceberg. Emily had seen plenty of cases like this, where the true depth of the damage only revealed itself over time. It was always complicated. There were no simple answers, no easy solutions. But one thing was clear: Ethan needed protection, and he needed it now. The precinct was quiet when they arrived, a few officers milling around, finishing up paperwork, and exchanging hushed words. Emily's eyes immediately sought out her partner, Officer Malone, who was standing near the desk. His face was grim, but there was a hint of relief in his expression when he saw her walking toward him with the child in her arms. "How's he doing?" Malone asked, his voice low and measured. Emily shifted Ethan in her arms, the little boy still clutching her tightly. "He's quiet now. He calmed down a little, but I can tell he's scared. He's not really reacting to anything, though. He's in survival mode." Malone nodded, his gaze flickering to the child. "It's good that you got him out of there. The mom, she's not in a good place. There's more going on than we know." Emily didn't respond immediately. She was still thinking about Sarah, the way she had lashed out, the way she had tried to defend her actions, as though the whole situation had been normal. She could still hear the disbelief in Officer Malone's voice when they'd realized what had happened. "She hit him, right in front of us," Emily said quietly, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "I don't know how she didn't think we'd see it. It's like she didn't care. Like none of it mattered." Malone's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. "It doesn't make sense. People like that, they don't just wake up one day and decide to do something like that. There's history there, something deeper." He paused, his eyes narrowing as though he was putting the pieces together. "I looked up her file. She's got a history of issues, substance abuse, run-ins with the law, you name it." Emily sighed, feeling the weight of it settle deep in her bones. "Yeah, I figured. She's a product of that cycle, isn't she? It's not just about her. It's about what she's been through, the things she's carried with her." She hesitated, glancing down at Ethan's small form in her arms. "But that doesn't excuse what she did. No child should ever have to go through that." "No," Malone agreed, his tone soft but firm. "No one should." Emily knew the conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had only begun to scratch the surface of this case, and she knew that there were layers to it, more secrets that would come to light in time. But for now, there was one priority, and it wasn't Sarah Thompson or her troubled past. It was Ethan. A few minutes later, Emily was in the small interview room with the child, sitting across from a social worker who had just arrived. The woman, a seasoned professional with years of experience, had a calm demeanor, and her voice was soothing as she spoke to Ethan. "Hey there, sweetie," she said softly. "I'm going to help you now, okay? Can you tell me your name?" Ethan looked up at her with wide eyes, his fingers still wrapped around Emily's shirt. He didn't respond, but the social worker wasn't deterred. She gently held out a teddy bear, a small blue stuffed animal, and Ethan's gaze followed it with a flicker of interest. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and took it, clutching it to his chest. Emily watched the interaction with a heavy heart. The boy had been through more than anyone should have to endure, yet in that simple gesture, Emily saw a small glimmer of trust. "He's been through a lot," the social worker said quietly, noticing Emily's gaze. "It's going to take time for him to open up. We'll need to get him into a safe placement, someone who can care for him properly." Emily nodded. "What's next for him? I mean, where does he go from here?" "The system will take it from here," the social worker replied. "We'll make sure he's placed with someone who can give him the care and attention he needs. But it won't be easy. He's young, and children his age have a way of holding on to trauma, even if they can't fully express it. It's going to be a long road." Emily let out a long breath, her gaze shifting to Ethan, who was still staring at the teddy bear in his lap. There was so much ahead of him, so much healing, so much pain to work through. And yet, in that moment, all Emily could think about was how she had been the one to give him a small moment of peace, a sliver of safety in a world that had shown him nothing but hardship. She looked up at the social worker, her expression hardening with determination. "Do whatever you have to do. Get him to a place where he's safe. I don't care how long it takes." The social worker nodded, her face grim but understanding. "We'll make sure he's taken care of." As they left the room, Emily glanced back at Ethan one last time. He was still holding the teddy bear, his small frame curled into itself. But at least for now, he wasn't alone. At least for now, he was in the hands of people who cared. And Emily knew that she would do whatever it took to make sure that the rest of his story was one of hope, not pain. The next few days felt like an endless blur to Emily. Every time she closed her eyes, images of Ethan's tear-streaked face and trembling hands would flash before her, haunting her in the moments between sleep and wakefulness. The sound of his voice, small, fragile, and filled with a vulnerability no child should ever have to carry, echoed in her ears, a constant reminder of the horrors he'd experienced. The case had taken on a weight far heavier than Emily had expected. At the station, things were moving forward with the investigation into Sarah Thompson, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was being overlooked. The details about Sarah's background, the history of her neglect, her struggles with addiction, and her tumultuous relationships had all been logged, filed away, and analyzed by the detectives. But what about Ethan? His needs were immediate, his future uncertain, and that was the part of the case that Emily couldn't stop thinking about. She spent hours in meetings with Child Protection Services, discussing the best course of action for Ethan. He had been placed in a foster home temporarily, a woman named Laura who had agreed to take him in for the time being. Laura was warm, kind, and patient, but Emily knew that the situation would be far from ideal for Ethan in the long term. Foster care, while a necessary system, was a broken one. Children who had suffered trauma often ended up bounced between homes, struggling to find stability and security. Emily couldn't let that happen to Ethan, not after everything he'd been through. As the days passed, Emily found herself becoming more and more involved in his case, beyond what was strictly necessary. She couldn't help it. Ethan had made his mark on her heart in a way that she couldn't explain. It was as if a part of her had been awakened, the part that longed to fight for the underdog, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She spent time with Ethan in his new temporary home, bringing him toys and books, trying to engage him in conversation. But the boy remained withdrawn. His eyes held a quiet sadness that Emily couldn't understand. One afternoon, Emily sat with him in the small living room of the foster home, her eyes watching him closely as he traced his finger over the picture book she had brought. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived, but Emily noticed how his eyes seemed to linger on certain pictures, the ones depicting happy families, children playing, and parents hugging their little ones. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he turned the pages, and Emily felt a pang in her chest. He was yearning for something, a connection, a sense of belonging, something he had never known in his short life. "Do you like this book?" Emily asked gently, hoping to get him to speak. Ethan glanced up at her, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He nodded once, a soft, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. Emily smiled warmly, doing her best to reassure him with her presence. "I'm glad," she said softly. "You know, I think you're really special, Ethan. You have a lot of strength in you." The boy's gaze shifted to the window, his small hands clutching the book tightly. For a moment, Emily thought he might say something, but instead, he simply looked away, lost in his own world. It was clear that even in this moment of calm, Ethan was still carrying the weight of everything he had endured. That evening, Emily sat down with Laura, the foster mother, who had been trying her best to help Ethan settle into his new surroundings. The older woman's face was etched with concern, her brow furrowed in thought as she spoke. "He's been through so much, Emily. It's like he's trying to protect himself from everything. From me, from the world around him. He doesn't trust anyone, not even me. It breaks my heart." "I know," Emily replied quietly. "It's not going to be easy for him to trust again. He's been let down by everyone who was supposed to protect him. It's going to take time, a lot of time." Laura nodded. "But I can see something in him. There's a spark, just a small one, but it's there. I think if we keep showing him love and consistency, he'll start to open up. He just needs to know that someone's going to stick around, that he's not going to be abandoned again." Emily's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. She wanted so badly to believe that Ethan could heal, that he could learn to trust again. But she also knew that the scars left by abuse ran deep. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Over the next few weeks, Emily kept in close contact with Laura, checking in on Ethan's progress, bringing him small gifts, and spending time with him whenever she could. Ethan's demeanor began to change, ever so slightly. He became less withdrawn, though he still kept a distance from everyone. He started responding more when Emily talked to him, offering the occasional shy smile or a word here and there. It wasn't much, but it was something. One afternoon, Emily brought Ethan a new stuffed animal, a little lion with a tuft of wild curly hair. She knelt down beside him, holding it out to him with a gentle smile. "I thought you might like him," she said, her voice soft and encouraging. Ethan looked up, his wide eyes studying the toy for a moment before he reached out and took it. He didn't say anything, but Emily noticed the way he held the lion close to his chest, as if it were a lifeline. "You're a brave little guy," Emily murmured, her heart aching with empathy. "And I'm proud of you." As the weeks passed, Emily found herself more deeply invested in Ethan's healing process. It was clear that his journey wasn't going to be a quick one, but she couldn't give up on him. She couldn't let him slip through the cracks like so many children before him had. She would fight for him, even if it meant going against the system, pushing for a better future, and ensuring that Ethan had the stability and care he needed to overcome the trauma he'd endured. Emily wasn't just his officer now. She was his advocate, his protector in a world that had tried to break him. And no matter what it took, she would be there for him, every step of the way. But as she walked out of Laura's house one evening, her mind whirling with plans for Ethan's future, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was just beginning. Sarah Thompson, the woman who had hurt him, was still out there, and her story wasn't over. Neither was Ethan's. Weeks turned into months, And despite the slow and steady progress Ethan made, Emily found herself increasingly consumed by thoughts of the case. It was the kind of case that gnawed at you, the kind you couldn't let go of, no matter how hard you tried. The child's progress was heartening, but Sarah's absence, her unpredictable behavior, and the question of Ethan's future were constant burdens that weighed heavily on Emily's mind. During a routine check-in with Laura, the foster mother, Emily found herself caught in a conversation that reflected both the hope and the grim reality of Ethan's journey. "He's doing better, Emily. He's sleeping through the night now, eating well, and even playing with some of the other kids at the park. But every time I see him stare out the window like he's waiting for someone, I can't help but feel like I'm just a temporary place for him. It's like he's always expecting someone to come and take him away again," Laura confided, her voice carrying a heaviness that Emily couldn't ignore. The words struck Emily harder than she anticipated. Ethan had been through so much, and no matter how kind, how patient, or how loving Laura was, he still felt like a visitor. He still clung to the idea that someone, his mother, his family, would come and rescue him from the cage of uncertainty. Emily thought about how children in foster care often live their lives waiting for things to change, often for things to go back to what they once knew. But that was a lie, wasn't it? Sometimes things couldn't go back. Sometimes they shouldn't. Despite these emotions, Emily continued her work, continuing her investigation into Sarah. She knew Sarah would need to face the consequences of her actions. But the deeper Emily dug into Sarah's past, the more complex the story became, and the more Emily understood just how deeply Sarah was embedded in a world of her own trauma. Sarah Thompson had not been raised in a normal home, Emily learned. Her mother, a woman who had always been overly strict and emotionally distant, had shown Sarah little affection or warmth. Her father, a man who had worked long hours in construction, was rarely home and offered even less in the way of emotional support. Sarah's only escape had been alcohol, something she had turned to in her teen years to numb the loneliness and isolation she had always felt. When Emily first saw Sarah, she assumed the woman was just another lost soul, someone whose actions were driven purely by selfishness and neglect. But the more Emily learned about Sarah's upbringing, the more she realized that there was a pattern, a cycle that had been passed down from generation to generation. Sarah wasn't the first in her family to turn to substances to cope with her pain, and unfortunately, she likely wouldn't be the last unless someone could break the chain. On one particular day, after a scheduled meeting with Child Protection Services, Emily found herself sitting in her patrol car in front of the local diner, where she knew Sarah had once worked. The sky was gray, and the air was cool, but Emily couldn't ignore the pull to go inside. The thought had been lingering in her mind for weeks. She needed answers. Answers that went beyond the surface. She needed to understand what had truly happened to Sarah, and in turn, what had happened to Ethan. She walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming as she entered. The place was nearly empty, save for a few regulars who sat in booths, enjoying their coffee. Emily made her way to the counter, where the familiar smell of grease and coffee filled the air. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s with graying hair tied in a bun, glanced up and smiled. "Well, if it isn't Officer Roberts, you want your usual?" she asked, her voice warm, as if they had known each other for years. Emily gave a slight nod. "Yeah, thanks, Karen. Just a black coffee, please." As Karen prepared the coffee, Emily's eyes wandered across the diner. And there, sitting by the window in a far corner, was Sarah. She was hunched over a plate of food, her face drawn and weary, her eyes dark and distant. It was the first time Emily had seen her without the facade, the protective wall she had put up when she had been confronted by the officers. Sarah looked like someone who had been broken long ago, someone who had been fighting demons long before she had brought her son into the world. Taking a deep breath, Emily approached the table, her boots clicking softly against the worn tiles. She didn't know what she hoped to achieve, but she knew this moment was inevitable. Sarah looked up as Emily approached, her eyes flicking nervously around the diner before landing on Emily's face. What do you want?" Sarah's voice was sharp, but there was a crack in it, a vulnerability that Emily hadn't seen before. "I wanted to talk," Emily replied quietly, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. "Not as an officer, Sarah, but as someone who's trying to understand. Understand why things happened the way they did. Understand what happened to you." Sarah stiffened, her shoulders tensing. "What's there to understand?" She muttered bitterly. "I'm a screw-up, okay? I ruined my son's life. I'm no good." Emily could feel the walls Sarah had built around herself, high, thick, and unyielding. She had been trying to protect herself for so long that even the idea of confronting her pain seemed unbearable. But Emily wasn't going to back down this time. She had to help Sarah see that it didn't have to be this way. "Sarah, you weren't born a failure," Emily said gently. "You were a young woman with dreams. You were smart, you were driven. But something happened along the way, something that led you down this path. What was it? What was it that made you turn to substances? What happened to that girl who wanted to change the world?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stared down at the table. Her voice broke as she spoke. "I don't know. I don't remember who I used to be. All I know is that I didn't have anyone to turn to. My parents, they didn't care. They never understood me. When I had Ethan, I thought everything would change, but I couldn't handle it. I couldn't." Sarah's words hit Emily like a tidal wave. The guilt, the shame, the hopelessness, it was all tangled up in a deep, painful knot inside of her. She had never had the tools to cope, never had the support she needed to be the mother Ethan deserved. Emily could see it now. Sarah was just as much a victim of her circumstances as Ethan had been. They were both trapped in the same cycle, fighting for survival in a world that had never shown them mercy. "You don't have to stay stuck in this, Sarah," Emily said softly, her voice unwavering. "You can break the cycle. You can change. But it starts with you. It starts with being honest with yourself about the choices you've made. And it starts with getting the help you need. For you and for Ethan." Sarah looked up at Emily, her face wet with tears. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I'm scared I'll fail him again." Emily leaned forward, her gaze steady and full of empathy. "You can, Sarah, but only if you're willing to fight for it. Not just for Ethan, but for yourself too. It won't be easy, but you don't have to do it alone. You have people who care. You have me." In that moment, Emily knew that breaking the cycle of abuse and neglect wasn't something that could be done overnight. But this conversation, this tiny crack in Sarah's hardened exterior, was the first step in a long and difficult journey. It wasn't just about saving Ethan anymore. It was about saving Sarah too. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of cautious hope. Maybe there was a way forward after all. Months passed, and the case continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Emily's investigation into Sarah's past had opened up a door she hadn't fully anticipated. The realization that Sarah's story, full of pain, neglect, and self-destructive choices, was not so different from the story of countless other parents caught in cycles of trauma. As she dug deeper, Emily discovered that Sarah's own mother had been a product of similar circumstances, abandoned by her own parents and raised in an abusive household. The generational damage was clear, and the implications were heartbreaking. Sarah hadn't just failed Ethan. She was struggling with a legacy of hurt that spanned decades. Yet, as Emily sat at her kitchen table one quiet evening, poring over the case files, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. Sarah's journey to healing was slow, and every step forward seemed like it was met with 2 steps back. But there was something in her eyes now, something that Emily hadn't seen before, a flicker of hope. The same hope she had seen in Ethan during his therapy sessions, when he finally began to trust again, when he started to smile without hesitation, when he started making connections, both with the world and with the people who were trying to help him. One afternoon, Emily received a call from Laura, the foster mother. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I think Ethan's ready for a visit with Sarah. It's been so long, and he's been asking about her a lot lately. He still has so much love for her, but there's this wall now. He wants to forgive her, Emily. He says he's ready to." The weight of those words settled heavily in Emily's chest. Ethan had come so far in his recovery, and yet the idea of him reconnecting with Sarah was terrifying. She knew the risks. It was a fragile moment, and the last thing anyone wanted was for him to experience another heartbreak. But as a child, that instinct to forgive and love was so pure, so untainted by the world's cruelty. How could Emily deny him the chance to reconcile with his mother? Emily arranged the visit, carefully setting boundaries and ensuring that both parties were prepared. Sarah had made significant progress in her rehabilitation, but there were still deep scars that had not yet healed. For Ethan, this would be his first encounter with her since the day she was arrested, and Emily wasn't sure what to expect. It could go wonderfully, or it could all fall apart. The day arrived, and Emily stood in the waiting room, watching as Sarah, dressed in a clean shirt and her hair freshly brushed, paced nervously. The woman had changed since their last encounter. Her eyes were clearer, her shoulders no longer hunched with guilt. She had started attending therapy regularly, and had even participated in a rehabilitation program for mothers in similar situations. But it wasn't just the external changes that mattered. It was the inner transformation. Sarah had finally started facing the truth of what she had done, and the weight of that truth had become a catalyst for her own healing. When Ethan walked into the room, his small hand clutching Laura's, the room seemed to hold its breath. The boy had grown taller, more confident, though there was still that underlying hesitance in his eyes. He had come a long way since his days of hiding from the world. But this moment, this reunion, was the ultimate test. Ethan's gaze flicked between Emily and Sarah before settling on the floor, his fingers nervously twisting together. Sarah knelt down, her voice trembling. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I wasn't the mother you needed me to be. I was lost, but I'm here now. I'll always be here for you." Emily held her breath, knowing that Ethan's response would dictate the next steps in their journey. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, in a soft, barely audible voice, Ethan spoke. "I missed you, Mommy." The words sent a rush of emotions through the room. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and she reached out, hesitating only for a second before pulling Ethan into her arms. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the two embraced. No longer mother and child torn apart by pain, but mother and child reaching for each other, rebuilding a fragile bond. As they sat together on the couch, Sarah holding Ethan's hand, Emily quietly stepped back, giving them space. She watched as Ethan slowly began to open up, speaking about his time in foster care and how much he had grown. It was as though the weight of his past was lifting, bit by bit, as he shared his hopes for the future. "I want to be a good boy now, Mommy," Ethan said, his small voice filled with hope. Sarah smiled through her tears, her voice thick with emotion. "You are a good boy, Ethan. You always were." The road ahead would not be easy. Both Sarah and Ethan had deep wounds to heal, and it would take time for them to truly rebuild their relationship. But this moment, the connection, the forgiveness, the shared tears, was a powerful first step. Over the next few weeks, Emily continued to check in on both Sarah and Ethan, observing their progress from a distance. She saw that Sarah, for all her flaws and mistakes, was genuinely trying. She was attending counseling, participating in family therapy sessions, and making amends wherever she could. Ethan, on the other hand, was thriving. He was once again laughing, playing with other children at school, and his grades had improved. His world, once consumed by fear and sadness, was beginning to feel safe again. There was a part of Emily that struggled with the complexities of the situation. She had never been one to offer forgiveness so easily, especially when it came to a parent who had caused so much harm. But as she watched Sarah and Ethan, she realized that true healing couldn't happen in a vacuum. It required both sides to fight, to reach out, to forgive, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And in that sense, Sarah and Ethan were both learning to break free from their pasts, slowly but surely. The turning point came when Sarah asked Emily for help. "I want to be there for Ethan. I want to do more than just visit. I want to be the mother he needs. Can you help me? Can you guide me?" Emily was surprised by the request. It wasn't easy for someone to admit that they couldn't do it alone. But Sarah was different now. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for support in building something real and lasting for Ethan's sake. And so, they began a new chapter. Sarah committed to being a better mother, and Emily continued to stand by, offering guidance, but also stepping back when necessary. The journey ahead would be long, but Emily knew that they were no longer on separate paths. They were working together toward a future that, though uncertain, was full of possibility. For Ethan, it was a chance to heal, to rebuild trust, and to learn that love could be messy but also redemptive. For Sarah, it was a chance to prove that no one, no matter how broken, was beyond hope. As the weeks turned into months, Emily couldn't help but feel that this was the part of the story where both mother and son would finally begin to flourish. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Emily felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a while: hope.